Now we're going to look at Griffiths chapter 4. And what Griffiths chapter 4 basically discusses is our verb situations. Um, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we get to verb situations, then our Griffiths looks at a couple of other particular issues. So he looks at arguments. He looks at the types of verbs called causatives. And then we need to distinguish between some meanings of important meanings between transitive and intransitive, unergative and unaccusative, which may be familiar terms to you from syntax if you've taken syntax or are taking syntax. But the bulk of this particular chapter is about the lexical aspect of verbs, what we call situation types. And these four situation types are achievement, accomplishment, activity, and perhaps a term that you're more familiar with is state or stative verbs. It is a problem that the three of these particular descriptions of the lexical aspect of verbs begin with A. So it's often a little difficult to keep track of these particular terms and their meanings. And finally, we need to look at the notion of agency, agents. Okay, let's start with the notion of arguments. And again, you may be familiar with this from your syntax class. And what arguments refer to are the obligatory referential constituents that verbs require. Okay? So if you look at the one argument verbs, the judge laughed. Okay? So apart from the verb, what do you need to make that a sentence, or what do you need to make that sensible? Well, you need a subject, the judge, and that's an argument. So this is a one argument verb. So a lot of intransitive verbs that don't take objects, don't need objects, can be considered to be one argument verbs. I cried and cried. Notice the verb is repeated, but we're not looking at verbs, we're looking at the necessary obligatory constituents that verbs have to have. If we look at two arguments, what we see here are transitive verbs, where the verb has an object. The note says that I have to be there at 9 o'clock. Thinking about last night, okay, that's the subject. As the verb, saddens me. Okay, so the me and the thinking about last night constitute two arguments. She was going to walk the dog. Okay, so we're looking at the verb walk, and you can have walk as a one argument verb. She walked, but we also have this particular expression of walking the dog. So we need two arguments. So verbs often can have either one or two arguments. If we look at three arguments, these tend to be the kinds of verbs that have a direct and indirect object. So the doctor explained the problem to her. So we've got three arguments. The doctor is the subject. And as you've noticed, an obligatory form of any verb in English is that we have to have a subject. So that's the minimal, SV is the minimal components of a verb phrase. So the doctor is this one argument, explained is the verb, and explain is a verb that has two arguments, a direct object and indirect object, the problem and to her. That he remembered my name, okay, that is still the subject, even though it is a clause in itself. Gives, okay, and give can take our two arguments. Gives me something, okay. Notice we can't just say gives me. We have to give something. And often these particular arguments are implicit. Don't talk to me that way. Now we have the imperative. Okay. Notice that we have an implicit our you there. You don't talk to me that way. That makes it a 3-argument verb. So imperatives have the implicit you, that's the first argument, and with a verb like talk, we can have 2 arguments. Talk to me that way. Of course, you can have talk with 2 arguments to talk. Don't talk nonsense. Okay, so that's an important way of getting at the notions of transitivity and intransitivity, which we'll look at a little later. The next particular type of verbs that Griffiths discusses are what are called causatives. Okay, and what we know about causatives is that the proposition carried by the embedded clause is entailed by the whole sentence. Okay. So the idea made her smile entails she smiled. That is the state that has been brought about. That is the state that's been caused. So the entailment is whatever is caused. Vicky got the car to start, entails Vicky started the car. The teacher had Joe redo the test. Well, plural Joe redid the test. That's the entailment, which is the result of the cause of the teacher having Joe redo the test. The lock stopped the kids from eating the cookies. Well, poor kids, they didn't eat the cookies. That is the entailment, okay? So you cause some things to happen and you cause things not to happen. If you look at that a little bit closer, we can actually describe it. X cause, and then we have a clause, the embedded clause, which is really the entailment, entails that particular clause. Okay. And you can look at it in terms of superordinates and hyponyms in some particular verbs. So we have the verb cause, and then we have different ways of causing, forcing, persuading, cajoling, etc. And causative verbs have a minimum of 2 arguments. You have to have the causa, and then you have to have the cause state or event, and that's the embedded situation, the embedded clause. So if you look at a sentence like, the teacher had Joe redo the test, okay? So teacher is the first argument, then cause, had, to have somebody do something, and the embedded clause is Joe redo the test. And that embedded clause is the same as the entailment, okay, which is Joe redid the test. We can talk about direct and indirect causation. So if we look at something like direct, Tony handed Kim a book, okay? And we can, the entailment of that is Tony caused Kim to have a book, okay? Or Kim had a book. And what about this though? In an indirect situation, Tony left a book in Kim's car. Now we can also say that Tony caused Kim to have a book, and Kim had a book, whether she knew it or not, okay? So we can have direct causation, okay, and indirect causation. And notice the entailments are the same for the direct and the indirect causation, but of course the particular way those causatives are described, a direct causative as in hand something to somebody, and an indirect causative such as to leave something in somebody's car. Okay, so we can begin to map out causatives and their entailments according to different kind of types. So, for example, we can contrast different verbs. You can feed the cat, and if you feed the cat, then the cat ate. So she fed the cat tofu, therefore the cat entails the cat ate tofu. You can have morphologically related verbs and adjectives. So you have a verb like to blind. The flash blinded Bill, and the entailment is Bill became blind, and so we're going from the verb to the adjective. And then we can have the same verb, causative and non-causative. So we grew chard last year, which is causative, and that entails chard grew last year. And that's what we call an unaccusative. Talk a bit about that later. But notice the chard doesn't cause itself to grow. It's something causing the chard to grow. Okay, so let's look at these words that we've mentioned already. First, we can talk about transitive and transitive verbs. Transitive verb needs to have at least two arguments, and we've got what we can call an object. So I'm walking the dog. Okay. I killed the plant. Okay. I spilt the coffee. These are all transitive verbs, and notice there's a couple of arguments there. Notice we can, with these verbs, look at them as intransitive. So I'm walking to New Orleans is a intransitive verb, and it's what we call an unergative. And it's a fancy word, and there's a lot of verbs like that. Okay. The second one, unaccusatives. Notice I killed the plant died. My pet spider passed away, and I spilt the coffee spilt. So an unergative verb requires a subject that is consciously responsible for what happens. Okay. And we can begin to use the carefully test, right? So I'm carefully walking to New Orleans. Yeah, sounds good. Okay. The plant carefully died. No, that's weird. So a test for distinguishing between unaccusatives and unergatives is the idea of a conscious subject, okay, responsible for what happens, and you can use that carefully test. Okay, now let's get on to the main part of this particular chapter, and this is the notion of the lexical aspect of verbs. So we have these kinds of lexical aspects, spectral categories, and this particular taxonomy was first introduced by Wendler. There's been various treatments of this, various different versions of it, but this is the more or less the basic one that is used when we refer to the lexical aspect of verbs. So, for example, our states are, and some examples there are seem, know, want. Activities, it's raining, I'm playing dominoes, I'm talking to my friend. Accomplishments usually take a noun phrase, okay? I painted a picture, I read a book, I built a house. And achievements tend to be something which is kind of instantaneous, or they don't really have duration. So arrive, leave, recognize. We can begin to distinguish them according to particular features, and I've just mentioned some of those features. So the feature that distinguishes achievements, arrive, leave, recognize, is the notion of being punctual. And punctual means momentary, focusing on beginnings and endings of actions. Okay, think of words like explode. The other term that can be used here to describe and distinguish these verbs is the notion of telic, and telic has meaning having an end result. So this is the way that we can distinguish both accomplishments and achievements. So because they both have an end result or an ending, or they're goal oriented. Further term that we can use is the notion of dynamic, and this helps distinguish activities, accomplishments, achievements from the notion of states. They have inherent duration. Notice achievements have kind of a not much in the way of duration, but they do have some duration. Okay. Um, when we talk about states, we don't talk about inherent duration. They're just states. Um, um, let's have a little look at the notion of these particular lexical types, and this is one way of getting at these particular distinctions, and this is in the form of a kind of a narrative. So if you think of poor Lucy, she broke her leg. Um, this is what we call an achievement, and one test for this is interruptibility. Okay, you can use the phrase "she stopped doing something," "she stopped breaking her leg." Notice that is a very weird meaning. You'd have to have some conscious ability to keep breaking your leg, and which you consciously stop. But the meaning here is not about that. It's about some kind of instantaneous momentary action. Okay, um, and we can't interrupt it. Um, Once she'd broken her leg, then she has a state. She's in the state of having a broken leg. And of course, one test for that is the use of the progressive. Can you use the progressive with it? She was having a broken leg. Sounds weird. Okay. Um, so test for states is the notion of they often resist the progressive. Notice there are some verbs that we often use in the stative that can take a progressive, but it changes the meaning. It makes them into dynamic verbs. So I have a cat is stative. I'm having dinner makes that not stative, but it's an actual dynamic. So same verb, but one is stative and one is dynamic. An activity, she had treatment. One test of that, of course, is that you can use that with a progressive. She was having treatment. And then she got better is an accomplishment, and this again has a particular endpoint. One test of this is the restitutive again, that is, you revert to an original state of being better or of being good. Okay, um, so she got better. She got better again. She's walking again. She couldn't walk, and now she can. So you're restoring an original situation. Okay, so there's a summary of the particular lexical types and the kinds of tests we can do for them. Okay. Another way of looking at these verbs is their interaction with agents and goals. Okay, so remember, an agent is a consciously responsible entity, responsible for what happens. So if we look at states, we have uh, we don't talk about agents, right? And where there's no goal orientation involved, Joe owned a convertible. Okay, you look tired. Every little but counts. These are not agents. They're not responsible for what happens. Okay. Um, Look at contrast that with achievements, where you do have a particular goal. Joe received a convertible. I heard a bang. She realized that coglione meant testicles in Italian. Really? Okay, good. Um, these are what we call achievements, and they have a particular goal. And again, we don't talk about these as being agents. For example, Joe, the semantic classification of Joe in Joe received a convertible is as a receptive. Okay, I, as in I heard a bang, is an experiencer. Similarly with she, and she realized. So with our states and achievements, we can have no agent, and notice that states are minus goal and achievements are plus goal. If we look at activities, we can have activities that don't have a goal. It's one of the definitions of activities that don't have a goal. You're just doing something. And you can have either an agent or not an agent. So this machine embroiders. Um, Notice machines here are not really the agent of the verb. Someone was listening. He slept. You're not really an agent of sleeping. Okay. Then we can have our accomplishments, and of course these are plus goal. And again, we can have either agents or not agents. So the river flooded the road. The river is not an agent. Okay. The hikers walked to Hebden Bridge. Yeah, that's an agent. And the campers are packing up. Notice packing up there, the use of that little particle with the verb to pack gives it the sense of accomplishment. Okay, we talked about the carefully test with states and achievements. If we don't have an agent, notice the weirdness of using carefully. Joe carefully owned a convertible. No. You carefully look tired. No. Every little but carefully counts. No. Joe carefully received a convertible. I don't know about that. I carefully heard a bang. No. She carefully realized. No. Whereas with activities and accomplishments, whether it's with plus and minus agents, are it depends upon whether it's a particular agent or not. So this machine carefully embroiders. I don't think machines can carefully do things. Someone was carefully listening. Yeah. He carefully slept. No, not really, because he's not really the agent of sleeping. The river carefully flooded the road. No. The hikers carefully walked to Hebden. Yes, because that's hikers are agents. And the campers are carefully packing up. Yeah, because campers are agents. So carefully is one way. Notice these are not totally clear-cut tests, but it's one way of separating out states and achievements from activities and accomplishments. Okay, another test for is one for states, is the what did he do test. What did he do? He slept. Okay, so that's not a stative verb. Okay, it's an activity. What did Joe do? He owned a convertible. Not really. You can't say that as an answer to that. So what did he do? And the response, if it fits, then we can see that it's determined whether verbs are stative or not. Some of the ones tests we can use, and these were with time prepositions, like phrases like in and for. So if you think about achievements, which is plus goal, you can use the preposition in with a time phrase. So she realized in 20 seconds after she had heard it, the coglione meant testicles in Italian. Okay. And with accomplishments, they actually built a house in 10 days. And so that suggests that it is something it's completed and it's goal-oriented. They planted the field in a week. That suggests that the field was completely planted. So in plus a time phrase suggests either achievements or accomplishments. A goal has been achieved. Contrast that with the preposition for in a time phrase. Joan owned a convertible for a week. Okay, you can't say Joe owned a convertible in a week. And activities, he slept for 10 hours. You can't really say he slept in 10 hours. Um, and then have a look at the phrase, they planted the field for a week. Contrast that with they planted the field in a week. In a week suggests that it's complete, okay, and that it's goal oriented. They planted the field for a week does not mean that the particular field is completely planted. It's just telling you about a particular time period. So in that sense, it's an activity, okay? So what did you do for a certain amount of time describes an activity. One other particular test we can use is what are called locative goal phrases, completive particles and direct objects, which signal accomplishments. So, locative phrase, to the hikers walked to Hebden Bridge, suggests that that is an accomplishment. Okay. Um, uh, Notice the difference between to and towards. Towards would be referring to a particular activity, but to has the notion of completion. The campers are packing up. There's the particle. We mentioned that before. So any kind of use of up as a particle with a verb suggests an accomplishment. And again, we've looked at this before, but slightly different here with these particular phrases. They planted the field with the wheat, okay, which suggests the whole field was completely planted with wheat. They planted the wheat in the field, okay, suggests that the wheat was used up, but not that the field was planted completely. So depending upon the order of the what becomes the direct object there uh, suggests the notion of the particular accomplishment. Okay, have a look at that chapter. It's not easy to follow, but this is a very important distinction, the notion of lexical aspects of verbs. You'll find it very useful in looking at a lot of different things.